Clara stopped shivering on a Tuesday. That's the detail that changed everything. Not the thermometer reading, not the firewood calculations, not the sound of wind finding every gap in the cabin walls. It was the moment Helen looked across the room at her daughter and realized the girl wasn't shivering anymore. She was just sitting there, still, wrapped in 3 blankets, staring at nothing. Helen crossed the cabin in 4 steps and put her hand on Clara's forehead. Cold. Not cool. Cold. The skin felt like touching a window. Amos. He was at the table trying to sharpen a blade that didn't need sharpening, because sharpening something was easier than sitting still in a cabin where the temperature hadn't been above 38 degrees in 11 days. He looked up. She stopped shivering, Helen said. Amos set the blade down. He knew what that meant. Every frontier parent knew what that meant. When a child stops shivering, the body has stopped trying to warm itself. It's not a sign of improvement. It's a sign of surrender. The body is saying, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to start shutting down the parts of you that aren't essential, and I'm going to hope that someone does something before I run out of parts to shut down. He picked Clara up. She weighed almost nothing. He brought her to the stove and sat on the floor with her, pressing her against his chest, wrapping his coat around both of them. The cast-iron stove was burning hot. Georg had fed it 20 minutes ago, and the iron was radiating a cherry-red glow that you could feel from about 4 feet away. Beyond that, 4 feet, the cabin was freezing. The heat from the stove rose straight up, hit the ceiling, spread across it briefly, and disappeared through the gaps in the pine boards and the sod above. The heat went up. Always up. It never went sideways. It never reached the corners. It never warmed the floor where Clara had been sitting. She needs to be closer to the fire, Helen said. She was 6 feet from the fire. Then the fire isn't enough. Amos held his daughter and felt the cold coming through the floor beneath him, through his pants, through his skin, into his bones. The floor was the coldest surface in the cabin. The walls were cold. The ceiling was cold. But the floor was worst because cold sinks and heat rises, and the floor was in direct contact with frozen Minnesota earth that hadn't been above 32 degrees since October. Clara's breathing was shallow. Her fingers, when he unwrapped them from the blankets, were white at the tips. We need to get out, Helen said, not for the first time. Amos, this cabin is killing her. And go where? Anywhere. Walt and Agnes have a bigger stove. The Oaks have that second chimney. Anywhere that isn't this. Helen, Walt's cabin is 41 degrees. I checked last week. Agnes told me. They're burning 8 cords a month, and they're at 41 degrees. The Oaks have the second chimney, and they're at 39. Nobody's warm. Every cabin in this settlement is the same temperature. Nobody is warm. She looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before. It wasn't anger. Helen's anger was sharp and direct, and he could handle it. This was something else. This was the face of a woman calculating whether her husband could save her child, and arriving at an answer she didn't want. Then figure something out, she said, because I will not watch her die in this cabin. That night, after Clara was warmer, not warm, but warmer, sleeping between her parents on the bed near the stove, Georg pressed against the wall in every piece of clothing he owned. Amos lay in the dark and listened to the cabin breathe. Every cabin breathes. The logs expand and contract with temperature changes, making sounds like knuckles cracking. The wind pushes against the walls and the structure flexes, barely, just enough to let cold in through the chinking. The fire talks, popping, settling, the sound of wood being converted to heat that mostly goes up the chimney and out into the Minnesota sky where it does nobody any good. He thought about what Helen had said. Figure something out. The problem wasn't fuel. They had wood. They were burning 6 cords a month, which was half of everything he'd cut and split during autumn, and at this rate they'd run out by late February, with 4 weeks of winter still ahead. But the real problem wasn't the supply of wood. The real problem was that the wood wasn't doing anything useful. He'd watched the smoke rise from his chimney and calculated, roughly in his head, that for every log he burned, maybe a third of the heat stayed in the cabin. The rest went up the flue. 2/3 of every log gone. He was heating the Minnesota sky, not his family. But even the heat that stayed, it rose. It went to the ceiling. The ceiling was the warmest part of the cabin, and nobody lived on the ceiling. His children sat on the floor. His wife worked at a table. The floor was the coldest surface in the building, and that's where the life happened. It was upside down. The heat was in the wrong place. He needed the heat in the floor. The thought arrived whole, the way good ideas sometimes do, not piece by piece, but all at once, like a door opening onto a room he'd been standing outside of for months without knowing it. What if he could put heat in the floor? What if instead of fighting to keep heat from rising, he started the heat at the bottom? What if the floor itself was warm? He thought about the river stones. In Norway, when he was a boy, his uncle had a sauna. The sauna had a pile of stones in the corner, stacked in an iron basket over a fire. The stones got so hot you couldn't touch them. And the heat from those stones lasted hours. Long after the fire went out, the stones were still radiating warmth, still hot to the touch, still giving their heat back to the air around them. His uncle called them slow stones because they were slow to get hot and slow to cool down. They held heat the way a lake holds water, deeply, reluctantly, releasing it only gradually. What if he heated river stones in a fire, put them in pipes, ran the pipes under his floor, and let the stones radiate heat upward through the earth and the wood? He sat up in bed. Helen stirred. "What?" she said. "I need to go to the river tomorrow. It's 20 below. I know. I need stones." "Stones?" "I think I can heat the floor." Helen was quiet for a moment. In the dark, he couldn't see her face. Then she said, "Tell me in the morning. If it still makes sense in the morning, you can go to the river." It still made sense in the morning. He explained it to her at the table while Georg fed the stove, and Clara sat wrapped in blankets near the heat. He used his hands to show the idea. Stones, heated in a fire pit outside the cabin, then placed inside clay pipes that ran under the floor. The hot stones would radiate heat upward. The floor would get warm. The warm floor would heat the air above it, the air where his family lived. When the stones cooled, he'd pull them out, reheat them, put them back. A cycle, a rotation. Hot stones in, cool stones out. Hot stones in again. Helen listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, "How do you get the stones under the floor?" "I dig." "Dig what?" "I dig out the earth beneath the cabin. Not all of it. Just enough to lay the pipes." "In February." "Yes." "The earth is frozen solid." "I know." "You're going to dig frozen earth out from under our cabin in the middle of winter, while your daughter is sick, while we're running out of wood, while it's 20 below outside. That's what you're telling me." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Clara, who was watching them both with that quiet, observant stare she had, the one that missed nothing. "How long?" Helen asked. "I don't know, 2 weeks, maybe 3. "You have one." Helen, 1 week, Amos. 1 week to dig and build and make it work. After that, if it doesn't work, we go to Walt's. We go to somebody's. We stop pretending this cabin can keep us alive. 1 week. He nodded. 1 week. Georg, who was 14 and had been listening from the stove, said, "I'll help you dig." "You'll freeze," Helen said. "I'll dig fast," Georg said. Amos looked at his son. The boy was serious. He had that look that young men get when they understand that something real is happening, and they want to be part of it. Not for adventure, for family. "We start tomorrow morning," Amos said. "First light." "First light," Georg repeated. The river was a mile and a half south of the cabin. Amos and Georg left at dawn with the wooden sled, ropes, and a pickaxe. The temperature was 14 below zero. The walk took 40 minutes through snow that was thigh-deep in the drifts and knee-deep on the packed trail. The cold was immediate and personal. It went through their clothes in the first 10 minutes, and after that, movement was the only thing that kept the body functional. Stop moving and the cold would win within an hour. The river was frozen over, but along the banks where the water had been shallow in autumn, the stones were exposed, round, flat, smooth stones worn by centuries of water, ranging from the size of a fist to the size of a man's head. These were the stones Amos wanted. Smooth stones, because smooth surfaces make better contact with pipe walls. Dense stones, because dense stone holds more heat per pound. Flattish stones, because flat stones fit inside a pipe more efficiently than round ones. He tested one by holding it in his bare hand for 3 seconds. The cold from the stone was vicious. It sucked heat out of his palm so fast that his skin went numb almost immediately. That was good. It meant the stone had high thermal conductivity. If it could pull heat out of his hand that fast, it could also absorb heat from a fire that fast and hold it, and release it slowly inside a pipe under his floor. They loaded 46 stones onto the sled. The sled weighed roughly 300 pounds loaded. Amos and Georg pulled it back up the trail, leaning into the ropes, their boots slipping in the snow, their breath coming in white bursts that froze on their scarves and collars. Georg didn't complain. He pulled. His face was red and his hands were raw inside his gloves, and twice he stumbled and caught himself on the rope, but he pulled. They made the trip 3 times over 2 days. By the end, they had 138 stones piled beside the cabin. Helen came outside once, looked at the pile, looked at Amos, and went back inside without a word. The clay pipes were the part that worried him most. He needed hollow tubes, roughly 6 inches in diameter, long enough to run the length of the cabin, strong enough to hold the weight of hot stones without cracking. He didn't have manufactured pipe. Nobody on the frontier had manufactured pipe. What he had was clay. He dug clay from the creek bed a 1/4 mile east, a heavy red clay that was pliable when wet and brick hard when fired. He'd used this clay for chinking the cabin walls when they'd first built the place. Now he needed to shape it into pipes. He built a form from a fence post, a straight wooden cylinder, 4 inches in diameter, that he would wrap clay around and then remove once the clay had stiffened. The process was slow and maddening. He'd roll the clay flat on a board, cut a rectangular piece, wrap it around the fence post form, smooth the seams with wet fingers, and set it aside to stiffen. Each pipe section was roughly 18 inches long. He needed 32 sections to run 2 lines of pipe under the main room floor. The first 8 cracked when they dried too fast near the fire. He'd set them too close to the heat, eager to speed the process, and the clay contracted unevenly and split along the seams. 8 sections. An entire day's work. Gone. "Slower," Helen said, watching him stare at the cracked pieces. "Dry them slower." She was right. The next batch, he set further from the fire, covered them with damp cloth, and let them dry over 2 days instead of 1. These held. The clay turned from soft red to hard gray-red, and when he tapped one with a knuckle, it rang like a bell, solid, strong. Georg helped him join the sections together using a slip of wet clay at each joint, pressing the sections together, smoothing the connection, reinforcing it with a second layer of clay that he smoothed and shaped with his thumb until the joint was sealed. Each connection took 15 minutes of careful work. Georg's hands were better at this than his. The boy had patience and small enough fingers to work the clay into tight spaces. Father and son worked side by side at the table, Helen keeping the fire fed, Clara watching from her blanket nest by the stove. "Will it really work?" Clara asked on the third day of pipe making. "I think so," Amos said. "You think so, or you know so." Amos looked at his daughter. Her color was a little better today. Helen had been keeping her near the fire almost constantly, and the shivering had come back, which was actually good. It meant her body was fighting again. "I think so," he said. "But I'm going to find out. What if it doesn't work? Then we'll try something else. Mama says we're going to waltz if it doesn't work." Amos glanced at Helen. She was looking at the fire, deliberately not looking at him. "Your mama is smart," he said, "but let me try first." Day 4 was the digging. This was the part he'd been dreading. He had to get under the cabin floor, which meant removing a section of floorboards in the main room, then digging out enough frozen earth to create a trench roughly 8 inches deep, 2 feet wide, running the full length of the cabin. The floor would go back on top when he was done, and beneath it, the pipes would sit in their trench, packed in sand and earth, waiting for hot stones. The earth beneath the cabin was frozen to the hardness of concrete. His pickaxe bounced off it the first 3 swings, barely leaving a mark. Georg tried and had the same result. The vibration of metal striking frozen ground traveled up the handle, through their arms, into their shoulders and necks. After an hour, they'd carved a groove maybe 2 inches deep and 3 feet long. "This won't work," Georg said, breathing hard. "Not in a week," Amos thought. He looked at the stove, cherry red and radiating heat uselessly into the ceiling. He looked at the frozen earth beneath his feet. And he had an idea. "Help me move the stove." "What?" "Help me move the stove onto this section of earth. The heat will soften the ground." They muscled the 400-pound stove, sliding it on iron legs that screeched against the wooden floor, until it sat directly over the exposed section of earth where they'd removed the floorboards. The stove's radiant heat began pouring downward into the frozen ground. They waited 4 hours. Then Amos swung the pickaxe into the earth beside the stove. It sank 3 inches on the first swing. The heat had thawed the top layer of earth to a workable softness. They dug furiously, moving the stove along as they went, thawing section after section, digging behind the heat, racing to excavate each patch before it froze solid again. The process was awkward and exhausting. Move the stove, wait, dig, move the stove, wait, dig. But it worked. By the end of the first day, they had a trench 8 feet long. By the end of the second day, the trench ran the full 16-foot length of the cabin. Helen helped pack the loose earth away from the trench edges. She said nothing about the chaos of her home, the displaced stove, the hole in the floor, the dirt everywhere, the cold that was worse now because they'd opened the floor to the frozen ground beneath. She helped because helping was faster than arguing, and the week was half over. Day 6. They laid the pipes. Amos placed the first pipe section in the trench, resting it on a bed of sand he'd collected from the creek bed. The pipe sat level and solid. He placed the second section, pressing the joint together with fresh clay, sealing it. Georg worked from the other end, doing the same thing. They met in the middle, and when the last joint was sealed and smoothed, they had a continuous clay pipe running the full length of the cabin beneath the floor. He did it again. A second pipe, parallel to the first, 8 inches apart. 2 lines of pipe running under the floor. The pipes were open at both ends. One end would face a fire pit he'd build outside the cabin wall, where he'd heat the stones. The other end would be the extraction point, where he'd pull the cooled stones out. "How do the stones get in?" Georg asked. "I heat them in the fire pit outside. When they're hot, I push them into the pipe from one end. They slide along the pipe. The inside is smooth. When they cool down, I pull them out the other end and put them back in the fire. How many at a time? 10 or 12 per pipe. Maybe more, we'll see. He packed sand and loose earth around the pipes, filling the trench, tamping it down with a flat board. The sand was important. It made better contact between the hot pipe surface and the earth above, which would conduct the heat upward through the floor. He left the top of the trench slightly below the floorboard level, so there was a thin air gap between the packed sand and the wood. This would prevent the floor from getting too hot, while still allowing heat to radiate upward. He replaced the floorboards. The floor looked normal again. Beneath it, invisible, 2 clay pipes ran the full length of the cabin, packed in sand and earth. Waiting. Day 7. The test. Helen stood in the cabin with Clara and Georg. Almus was outside, beside the fire pit he'd built against the cabin's east wall. The fire pit was simple, a circle of stones with a hot fire burning inside. 12 river stones sat in the coals, and they'd been there for 2 hours. When Amos picked one up with iron tongs, the stone was glowing a dull red-orange. Heat poured off it in visible waves. He placed the first stone into the open end of the pipe. It fit. The stone slid into the clay tube, and he pushed it forward with a long wooden rod. Then the second stone. The third. By the time he'd loaded 12 stones into the first pipe, his face was burning from the heat of the fire, and his hands were shaking from the effort of working the tongs. He loaded the second pipe. 12 more stones. 24 hot stones now sat inside 2 clay pipes running beneath his family's floor. He went inside. The cabin was the same temperature it had been all winter, 38 degrees, breath visible, cold walls, cold windows, cold everything. Helen was standing in the middle of the room with her arms crossed, watching the floor the way you watch a pot that's supposed to boil. 5 minutes. Nothing. 10 minutes. Amos pressed his palm against the floor. Cold. 15 minutes. Nothing. Georg looked at his father. The boy's face was carefully neutral, the face of someone who wants to believe but is preparing not to. 20 minutes. Amos pressed his palm against the floor again. He held it there. He closed his eyes. Warm, not hot, not dramatic, but warm. The wood beneath his hand was warmer than the air around it. The heat was coming up from below, through the sand, through the earth, through the wood, into his palm. Helen! She came. She knelt down and pressed her palm where his had been. She held it there for a long time. Her face didn't change at first. Then her jaw tightened, and her eyes closed, and she pressed harder, as if she could draw the warmth into her body through the floor. "It's warm," she said. "It's warm," Amos confirmed. Clara came over without being asked. She sat down on the floor and put both palms flat against the wood. She looked up at her father with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. The face of a child who had been cold for so long that warmth itself had become a surprise. "The floor is warm," she said. Like she was reporting something impossible. Like she needed someone to confirm that she wasn't imagining it. "The floor is warm, baby." Within an hour, the temperature in the cabin had climbed to 46 degrees. The heat was radiating upward from the entire center section of the floor, a strip roughly 2 feet wide running the full length of the room. You could feel it through your shoes. You could feel it through stockings. Clara sat directly on the warm section and refused to move. Georg sat beside her. Helen stood watching the thermometer on the wall, watching the mercury climb in tiny increments. 48 degrees. 50. 52. By evening, the cabin was 55 degrees. Amos had gone outside 3 times to swap cooled stones for freshly heated ones. Each cycle took about 20 minutes. Pull the cooled stones from the far end of the pipe with a rake, carry them to the fire pit, put them in the coals, load the newly heated stones into the pipe from the other end. 20 minutes of work. Every 4 hours. That was all. Helen cooked dinner without her shawl on. Out. She hadn't done that since October. Georg sat at the table doing nothing in particular, and the nothing was remarkable, because usually he was huddled by the stove trying to stay warm. Clara fell asleep on the warm floor, just lay down on it and closed her eyes and slept. And Helen didn't move her, because for the first time in months, the floor was a safe place to sleep. That night, Amos and Helen lay in bed. The cabin was 52 degrees. It had cooled slightly since the last stone swap, but 52 was warmer than the cabin had been at any point during the winter. Warmer than Walt's cabin. Warmer than the Oaks cabin. Warmer than any cabin in the settlement. "How much wood did you burn today?" Helen asked in the dark. 2 logs in the fire pit. 2 logs? 2 logs, to heat the stones. Helen was quiet. Then she said, "We've been burning 6 logs an hour in that stove, all winter. 6 logs an hour and the cabin was 38 degrees. You burned 2 logs today and the cabin is 52. "The stones hold the heat," Amos said. "The fire heats them, and they hold it. They release it slowly inside the pipes, and the heat goes up through the floor. None of it goes up the chimney. None of it is wasted. All of it goes into the floor." 2 logs, Helen said again. She rolled over and pressed her face against his shoulder, and he felt her crying. She didn't make a sound. He just felt the wetness on his shirt. He put his arm around her, and they lay there in a cabin that was warm for the first time since autumn. And he understood that what he'd built wasn't just a heating system. It was the difference between his wife breaking and his wife surviving. It was that close. The next morning, the cabin was 49 degrees. Amos went outside, reheated the stones, loaded them back in. Within an hour, the cabin was back to 54. The system worked. It was consistent. It was repeatable. It was real. The next morning, the cabin was 49 degrees. Amos went outside, reheated the stones, loaded them back in. Within an hour, 54. He did this 3 more days, and each day the rhythm got smoother. Heat the stones, load the pipes, wait, swap, repeat. On the 5th day, a pipe cracked. He heard it from inside, a sharp sound like a branch snapping, followed by a hissing. He pulled up the floorboards and found it immediately. The 3rd section from the fire pit end had split along its seam. The clay had been weakened by thermal cycling, hot, cold, and the constant expansion and contraction had found the weakest joint and broken it. The crack ran the full length of the section. The pipe was useless. "No," Amos said. He said it quietly, on his knees in the trench, looking at the broken clay. It was the voice of a man who had put everything into something that was now breaking apart beneath his hands. Helen appeared above him, looking down into the trench through the gap in the floor. "How bad?" she said. "1 section. Cracked through. Can you fix it?" "I have to replace it. I have to make a new one and let it dry and fire it and—" "How long?" 2 days, maybe 3 if the clay takes longer to dry." Helen looked at the broken pipe. She looked at her husband kneeling in a hole beneath their floor. She looked at Clara, who was sitting on the warm section that still worked, the section where the pipes were intact, and the girl's face was worried because she could hear the tone in her father's voice. "You have extra pipe sections," Helen said. "What?" "You made 32 sections. You used 28. I watched you count them. There are 4 extra on the shelf in the barn." Amos stared at her. He'd forgotten. He'd made extras in case some cracked during the drying process, and then, when they all survived, he'd set the extras aside and forgotten them completely. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right. Go get them." He replaced the cracked section in 2 hours. But the failure taught him something. He reinforced every joint in the system that evening, adding a second layer of clay to each connection, wrapping them in strips of wet burlap that he then sealed with more clay. The wrapping gave the joints flexibility. They could expand and contract with the heat without cracking. It was Helen's idea. She'd watched him struggling with the clay and said, "Wrap it like you'd wrap a bandage. Give it room to move." He never had another crack. He spent the following week making it better. He built a third pipeline, running alongside the first two, widening the warm zone on the floor from 2 feet to nearly 4 feet. He fashioned a crude iron rake for pulling stones out, a long handle with a hook on the end that could grab a stone and slide it along the pipe. He experimented with stone size. The larger stones held heat longer, but took longer to heat up. The smaller stones heated fast, but cooled within 2 hours. He settled on stones roughly the size of a melon. These heated in 90 minutes and held useful warmth for nearly 5 hours. That meant he only needed to swap stones 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and before bed. Helen started keeping a log. She recorded the cabin temperature every 4 hours, the number of stones swapped, the amount of wood burned in the fire pit. The numbers were remarkable. Before the system, they burned 6 cords of wood per month. After the system, they burned less than 1 cord per month because the fire pit was small, the fire was concentrated, and the stones captured and transferred the heat with an efficiency that the cast iron stove could never match. She calculated the savings. 6 cords at 40 cents a cord was $2.40 a month. 1 cord was 40 cents. They were saving $2 a month. Over a 5-month winter, that was $10. Their annual income was roughly $60. The system saved them nearly 17% of their yearly earnings. And more importantly, their daughter was warm. Clara's color came back within 4 days. The blue had left her lips. Her shivering stopped. Properly this time because she was warm, not because her body had given up. She started moving around the cabin again, playing, talking, being a child instead of a survival patient. Helen watched this transformation with an expression that Amos saw but didn't comment on. It was the expression of a mother who had been preparing for grief and was now being handed relief and didn't quite trust it yet. The rhythm of it became something Amos looked forward to. 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, before bed, he'd go outside to the fire pit. The cold would hit him like a wall every time, no matter how many times he did it. 20 below doesn't get familiar. You just learn to move through it faster. He'd pull the cooled stones from the pipe's far end with the iron rake, scraping them along the clay with a sound like grinding teeth. He'd carry them in a canvas sling to the fire pit, lower them into the coals and wait. The stones would hiss when they hit the hot coals, moisture trapped inside the stone vaporizing on contact. After 90 minutes, the stones would glow dull red-orange, and the heat coming off them would make his face feel sunburned even in the freezing air. He'd carry the hot stones back, load them into the pipe, push them in with the wooden rod, and go back inside to the warmth he'd created. Helen started calling it Amos's chores. She'd say it with a half smile that was the closest thing to affection she showed in public. "Amos, time for your chores." And he'd put on his coat and go. The regularity of it gave structure to days that had previously been shapeless. Wake up cold, feed the stove, huddle, feed the stove, huddle, sleep cold. Now there was purpose. Now there was a task that actually worked, that produced measurable results, that rewarded the effort. One afternoon, Georg came outside with him for the stone swap. They worked together in silence for a while, Georg pulling cooled stones, Amos loading hot ones. Then Georg said something that Amos would think about for years. "Pa, before the pipes you were scared." Amos stopped. He looked at his son. "What?" "You were scared." You tried to hide it, but I could see it. Every night when you checked the woodpile, your face changed. You were counting how many days we had, and your face would get tight like you were trying to hold something in. You don't do that anymore." Amos put down the tongs. He looked at the fire pit, at the stones glowing in the coals, at the snow falling silently around them. "You're right," he said. "I was scared." "Are you still?" "No, I'm cold right now, standing out here, but I'm not scared. There's a difference." Georg nodded. He picked up the sling of hot stones. "Let's get these in. Ma will worry." They went inside. The cabin was 56 degrees. Clara was sitting on the warm floor drawing pictures on a piece of brown paper with a charcoal stick. She'd drawn the cabin and underneath it a network of lines that were supposed to be the pipes. Inside the pipes, she'd drawn circles, the stones, and above the cabin, instead of smoke from a chimney, she'd drawn wavy lines rising from the floor and the word warm in wobbly capital letters. Helen saw the drawing and put it on the wall beside the thermometer. It stayed there for years. 2 weeks after the system was working, Walt Stroud showed up at the door. Walt was their nearest neighbor. His cabin was a quarter-mile north, visible from the Lindgrens' front window. Walt was a proud man, stocky, practical, competitive. He and Amos had an unspoken rivalry about whose crops grew better, whose fence held straighter, whose family was better prepared for winter. Walt had never asked Amos for anything. He knocked on the door at mid-morning. Amos opened it, and the cold rushed in, and the warm air rushed out, and Walt stood there in his beaver fur hat, with snow on his shoulders and a look on his face that Amos had never seen before. It was the look of a man who had noticed something impossible and needed it explained. "You haven't had smoke from your chimney in 3 days," Walt said. "No. Your main chimney. No smoke." 3 days. "That's right." Agnes noticed first. "She thought maybe you'd run out of wood, or maybe something happened. She asked me to come check." "Come in," Amos said. Walt stepped inside and stopped. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, and Amos watched his face change as the warmth registered. Walt's cabin was 41 degrees on a good day. This cabin was 54. "How?" Walt said. "Take off your boots," Amos said. "Step on the floor." Walt looked at him like he'd gone insane, but he pulled off his boots and stood in his wool socks on the cabin floor. His face changed again. "The floor is warm," Walt said. "Yes." "How is the floor warm?" Amos showed him. He took Walt outside to the fire pit. He showed him the stones heating in the coals. He brought him back inside, lifted 2 floorboards to reveal the pipe trench, and let Walt see the clay pipes packed in sand beneath the floor. "You run hot stones through clay pipes under your floor," Walt said, slowly, like he was testing whether the words made sense in that order. "Yes." "And that's why you haven't burned wood in 3 days." "I burn wood, in the fire pit, 2 logs a day, but the stove, no, I haven't run the stove in 2 weeks." Walt stood there for a long time, looking at the exposed pipes, then at the floor, then at the fire pit outside the window, then at Clara sitting comfortably on the warm floor, reading a book that Helen had brought from back east. A child, reading, on a floor, in February, in Minnesota. "How much to build me one?" Walt said. "It doesn't cost anything. Clay from the creek, stones from the river, labor." "How much labor?" "Took me a week, with Georg. I have 2 sons." "Then it'll take you less." Walt put his boots back on. He went to the door. He stopped. "Agnes is going to cry when I tell her about this," he said. "She's been praying for something. Anything. She thought I came over here to find you dead. She's going to cry." He left. The snow swallowed him within 30 yards, and Amos watched from the window until he saw the dark shape of Walt's cabin absorb him back. Agnes did cry, but she didn't wait for Walt to build it. She came to the Lindgren cabin herself the next morning, before Walt and the boys arrived. She knocked, and Helen answered, and Agnes stood in the doorway with tears frozen on her face. "Is it true?" she said. "About the floor?" "Come in," Helen said. Agnes stepped inside and stopped walking. She stood there, just inside the door, and her mouth opened slightly. She looked down at her boots. She looked at the floor. She looked at Helen. "Can I?" "Take your boots off," Helen said. "Stand on it." Agnes pulled off her boots with shaking hands and stood on the warm floor in her wool stockings. She stood very still. Then she covered her mouth with her hand and made a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite laughing. It was the sound of a woman who had been cold for so long that warmth was an emotion, not a temperature. "My children," Agnes said. "My children have been sleeping in their coats for 4 months." "I know," Helen said. "Sit down. I'll make you tea. Walt's coming with the boys to learn how it's done." Agnes sat at the table and drank tea and put her stockinged feet flat on the warm floor and didn't move them for 20 minutes. When Walt arrived with his 2 sons and shovels and a sled, she was still sitting there. "Show us," Walt said. Amos spent the day showing them. He showed them how to select stones, smooth, dense, flat. He showed them how to make the clay pipes, the form, the wrapping, the slow drying. He showed them the dimensions of the trench. He showed them the sand packing. He showed them the fire pit design. Georg helped Walt's sons understand the pipe joining technique, showing them how to work the clay into the joints the way Amos had taught him. Walt's system took 5 days. On the 6th day, his family had warm floors. Agnes walked across the cabin in bare feet in February, and she stood there, not moving, feeling the warmth come through the wood into her soles. And Walt was right. She cried. Within 2 weeks, Reverend Oakes came to see Amos. The Reverend was a careful man, not given to enthusiasm, not easily impressed. He'd heard about the system from Walt. He'd walked the 1/4 mile in deep snow to see it for himself. Amos showed him everything. The Reverend listened, asked precise questions, examined the pipes, pressed his hand to the floor, watched Amos swap the stones. When it was over, the Reverend sat at the table and accepted a cup of tea from Helen. The first cup of tea Helen had made for a visitor all winter, because until now the cabin hadn't been warm enough to make hosting anything other than an act of cruelty. "Do you understand what you've done?" Reverend Oakes said. "I heated my floor," Amos said. "You've done more than that. I buried 2 children my first winter here. 2 children from one family, the Holts. Their girl was 7. Their boy was 4. They didn't freeze to death, not exactly. They got pneumonia because the cabin was too cold for their bodies to fight it off. The cold didn't kill them directly. It killed their ability to survive being sick. Every winter since, I've watched families suffer through the same thing, and I've told them to pray and to endure, because I didn't have anything else to offer. I didn't have a solution. You do." The room was quiet. Helen had stopped moving. Clara was listening. "How many cabins do you think could use this?" Reverend Oakes said. Amos hadn't thought about it that way. He'd thought about Clara. He'd thought about Helen. He'd thought about his floor. "All of them," Georg said from across the room. The Reverend looked at the boy and nodded. "All of them." "Every single one?" He stood up. He put on his coat and his round spectacles, and he shook Amos's hand. Then he shook Georg's hand, a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The Reverend was acknowledging the boy as an equal participant in what had been built. "I'll tell the others," Reverend Oakes said. "I'll tell them to come here. I'll tell them what I saw and what I felt. And then you'll show them how to build it." "I'm not a teacher," Amos said. "You're not a teacher," the Reverend agreed. "You're a man who figured out how to keep his daughter alive. That's better than a teacher. That's someone people will believe." By March, 5 cabins in the settlement had the system. By April, when the thaw began and the urgency of heating faded, 8 families had either installed it or built the pipes and were ready for the following winter. Amos spent 2 weeks of March traveling between cabins, helping families dig trenches, showing them the clay technique, teaching their sons how to join the pipes. Helen kept the log going. Temperatures, wood burned, stones cycled, and the numbers didn't lie. Every family that installed the system cut their wood consumption by 80% or more. The Oakes family, who had the largest cabin in the settlement, had been burning 11 cords a month. With the pipes and stones, they burned 2. But it was what happened the following winter that proved the system wasn't temporary. That October, as the first frost came and the settlement braced for cold, Amos improved his design. He'd spent the summer thinking about what could be better. He built a stone-lined chamber beneath the fire pit, a reservoir where heated stones could sit and radiate warmth continuously without needing to be cycled as often. He designed the chamber so it connected directly to the pipes. The hot air from the heated stones would flow naturally through the pipe system as well as the stones themselves. It was a combination system now. Hot stones for direct radiant heat, and hot air moving through the pipes for convection. The first night of real cold that second winter, the cabin hit 61 degrees. Helen stood in the middle of the room in her bare feet and said, "This is what a home is supposed to feel like." Clara didn't get sick that winter. She didn't shiver. She didn't turn blue. She grew 2 inches between November and March, which Helen attributed to the warmth. A growing child in a cold cabin puts every calorie toward staying warm. A growing child in a warm cabin puts those calories toward growing. Georg, now 15, had become his father's partner. He understood the system completely, the physics of heat transfer, the importance of stone density, the critical role of the sand packing, the angle of the pipes, the timing of the stone cycles. When a new family wanted the system installed, Georg could manage the project almost independently. He'd become the thing that every frontier settlement needs, a young person who understands how something works and can teach it to others. By the spring of that second year, every cabin in the settlement had the system, every one. The settlement that had been slowly dying from cold, losing children to pneumonia, losing cattle to frozen barns, losing hope to the grinding mathematics of insufficient heat, was now comfortable. Warm floors, warm families, stacks of unused firewood that represented money not spent, time not wasted, bodies not broken by the labor of cutting and hauling and splitting. Reverend Oakes wrote a letter to his brother in Wisconsin describing the system. His brother showed the letter to a local newspaper editor. The editor published a brief account. Letters started arriving at the settlement, addressed to the Norwegian with the heated floors. Amos answered everyone. He drew diagrams. He described dimensions. He explained the stone selection, the clay technique, the fire pit design. He never charged anything. He never considered charging anything. The idea that keeping a family warm could be something you made money from seemed to him obscene. You taught it. You shared it. You helped people do it. That's all. Helen kept the log through that second winter. The final entry, dated March 14th, read, "Cabin temperature 58 degrees. Wood burned today. 2 small logs. Clara is reading by the window in her stockings. Georg is helping the Stroud boys lay pipes for their barn. Amos is drawing a design for a larger system for the meeting hall. The thermometer on the wall says it's 11 below outside. Inside, it feels like what I imagine home was supposed to feel like all along." Amos never thought of himself as an inventor. When people from other settlements would visit and ask him how he came up with the idea, he'd say, "My daughter stopped shivering. That's not a good thing. I needed the heat in the floor, so I put it there." Helen, standing nearby, would add, "He also needed me to give him a deadline, or he'd still be thinking about it." And Clara, who grew up warm because her father dug a hole in the floor and filled it with hot stones and clay pipes, Clara would remember the moment she pressed her palms to the warm wood and looked up at him and said, "The floor is warm." She would remember it as the moment she understood that love isn't always a word or a gesture. Sometimes it's a system. Sometimes it's engineering. Sometimes it's a man who spent a week crawling under his own house in the middle of winter because his daughter was cold. The floor was warm, and it stayed warm, and that, in the end, was everything.